Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you all to the first of our sessions in a series of peace dialogues. Today, we're focusing on the importance of conflict sensitivity. I have to say, in my 3 decades as a humanitarian worker, I can't recall a more complex time, whether we're talking about Sudan, Gaza, Myanmar, Afghanistan, or when we add some of the complexities like social media, AI, not to mention the tremendous geopolitical considerations, the challenges to multilateral action, the funding shortfalls, everything that we have going on in the world right now. And these compounding crises and shocks have underlined the importance and the relevance of taking a humanitarian development peace nexus approach to ensure that our limited resources are utilized effectively and so that we can address the root causes of humanitarian need by linking with development and peace actors and activities. Thank you all for those of you who continue to join. Just asking everybody to please put your systems on mute as you're coming in, and we will continue to bring more people into this discussion. But in the interest of time, we will go ahead and get started since we're now 5 minutes past our planned start time. So let's go ahead and have our conversation here today. My name's Valerie Guarnieri. I am one of the co-chairs of the Operational Policy and Advocacy Group, and I'm delighted to be hosting our conversation today as a peace dialogue, the first peace dialogue on the importance of conflict sensitivity. And this is a discussion that has been spearheaded by the Task Force 4 under the OPAG group that I co-chair. And as I was saying, I really can't recall a more complex time to be a humanitarian worker, nor can I recall a time where it's more important than it is now that we really look at how we bring together humanitarian and development and peace action on behalf of the people who we serve. I think we all realize that in that difficult combination, the peace pillar has proven to be the most challenging element to really ensure that we have that effective collaboration across the nexus, especially for humanitarian actors. It's often seen as that missing piece to fully operationalizing the nexus. And to unlock the P in the HDP nexus, IASC Task Force 4 has taken a lot of efforts in recent years to combine and collate our collective knowledge and experience on the peace pillar of the nexus. In 2020, there was an issue paper on exploring peace within the humanitarian development peace nexus that looked at the complementarity between humanitarian development and peace action and its implications for humanitarian programming. Also in 2020, WFP, where I work, and IOM co-led a work stream on this topic and partnered with Inner Peace to produce an IASC working paper on the mapping and analysis of tools and guidance on the humanitarian peace linkages of the nexus. And one of the things from that analysis was that if we're going to really operationalize the nexus, we need a common understanding of the concept. We need to unpack some of the challenges and opportunities. We need to have dialogue with actors across the nexus, document and share best practice, learning tools and guidance. And this kind of dialogue like we're having today is key for doing that. I have to say that the task force has also created the peace puzzle. It does sort of feel like a puzzle, and the peace dialogue series on different topics relating to peace to unpack these challenges and examine the barriers and opportunities when further integrating the peace pillar. It will build on previous efforts and ensure effective and complementary complementary humanitarian to peace links, and the initiative aims at helping practitioners to strengthen the peace dimensions of the Nexus approach and promote effective strategies for practitioners in crisis situations. So today, we're taking our first step on this path through the first session in the Peace Dialogue series on the importance of conflict sensitivity. The objective of today's session is to highlight the importance of conflict sensitivity, gather examples of its applications that are relevant for humanitarian actors, and that's going to help us really flesh out the ways in which peace can be operationalized in the HDP Nexus. I'm going to turn in a moment to Deanne Scheinberg from the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund, and she will talk to us about conflict sensitivity theory. And then we're going to follow that by a panel discussion where I'm going to be posing questions to a series of expert panelists. That I'll introduce one by one in a moment. And after we've heard from them, we'll have a time for an extended Q&A discussion. So that's where we are. That's what we're doing. Thanks again for joining this first session of the Peace Dialogue series. And let me welcome our first speaker, Deanne Scheinberg, to the floor. Deanne, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Valerie, and really glad to be here today. What I want to do in my presentation, and I hope that you can see my slides now. Yes, thumbs up or no? Great. Okay, perfect. So in my presentation, I want to focus on three parts. The first part, it's really get us all together to understand what do we mean by conflict sensitivity. The second part, why it is important for you, your work, and your respective organizations. And finally, I want to walk you through the 5 steps to incorporate conflict sensitivity in your work. Sorry, my slides don't seem to be moving, but now it should work like this. Hold on. Right, now you can see my, what is conflict sensitivity? Yes. Yes? Great.
Yes.
Sorry about that. The two screens always gets me a little bit confused. Wanted to flag that I'm building my presentation on this UNSDG good practice note conflict sensitivity. You can download it by just, downloading the QR code that is there. And I think that this really puts together a good reflection from the UN to really look at how we can look at this conflict sensitivity approach. I think that really what we want to think about, first of all, it's the context that all of you are working with and the challenges that go with it in terms of fluid political and security context, the different types of communities and actors, state actors, non-state armed groups we all work with daily. And then really look at this recognition that wherever we sit, being a humanitarian, a development or a peace builder, all our activities and the way we work cannot be separated from the peace and conflict context in which they are implemented. So conflict sensitivity, in a nutshell, is looking at how we work, what we do, and how we do it. And really, if you look at those 3 blocks, it's really thinking about understanding the conflict context and the actors and the interactions between them on one hand. Second, it's understanding the interactions between your work as a humanitarian worker, development practitioner, or a peace builder, and the interactions between you and the conflict, so your work and the peace and security conflict you're operating in. And then the third part, it's really around how do we move from knowing where we are working with and understanding the context and looking and moving from analysis to implementation. So how do we work? How do we adapt our work and our activities? What do we do and how do we do it? So this is really, I think in terms of the basis and the foundations, it's this understanding that we really want to minimize the risk of any activities, and we want to do more good than harm, and we don't want to increase any risk of violence by bringing a conflict-sensitive lens into our work. Now, moving on to the why conflict sensitivity. So, of course, what we want to do with our interventions is to minimize and managing harm, and we want to be able to also maximize opportunities to contribute to peace. So basically, we are looking at making sure that our interventions do not aggravate conflict dynamics. Food distribution, who gets included, how do we target our interventions, which communities do we work with, how do we create and look at one vulnerable community versus the other one, what roads are we using, where do we cross to go from point A to point B. So really looking at this approach of we don't want to aggravate conflict dynamics, a do no harm approach, and really strengthen work on sustainability, inclusion, and resilience. So if you look at this slide, it's really looking at conflict sensitivity starts at the do no harm, and it can be incrementally linking then to peace building and sustaining peace, but how do we do more good and contribute to peace and explicitly do good? Moving on a little bit to how do we go about this, from do no harm to having a bit of a maximalistic approach. And I think that it's nice to keep in mind these kind of 5 steps about how do we go in terms of incorporating conflict sensitivity. And that can be in the work that you do, your little project, your big program, the strategy of your organizations, and really to think about it from these different levels of project to strategy, but also in terms of how do we work as a community. So the 5 steps starts with the first one, which is understanding the peace and the conflict context. So really looking at analyzing the context of where you are, noting really the importance of and asking the question as an organization, where can I find this information? How do I understand and I get access to a good and updated conflict or context analysis, which is really the basis for conflict sensitivity. So some of the questions you would want that analysis to respond to, it's really looking at questions such as what is the background and the history of the conflict in the area where your activities are implemented? What are the peace and conflict factors or issues that influence peace and conflict? Who are the stakeholders that are involved? What are the relationships between them and how do they relate to the peace and the conflict factors? Who are the vulnerable groups? What factors make them more vulnerable? What also are the key dynamics that could really worsen or improve the peace and conflict in the short to the medium term? Looking also at step 2, it's once you know and you understand and you know where to access also this kind of information, it's thinking about how I understand the linkages between what I'm doing today and how this project or this intervention interacts with those conflict dynamics. And as you all know, working in the conflict that you're working in have risks and challenges. So it's really thinking around these two-way interactions. How is my work touching upon some of those conflict dynamics, and how these dynamics also interact with my work, and thinking about what am I doing? Is it still relevant today? Is it appropriate? Is it timely? How are new priorities emerging that are not being addressed? Can I still implement my activity today because there's increased violence? I cannot access this area. The numbers of IDPs have tripled and we're not providing a strong enough response. What is the differentiated impact that we are having on one community or another one? But also thinking about gender and youth dynamics. How am I making sure that my interventions are inclusive enough? So I think it's really understanding the way that our interventions can impact the context in terms of resources, in terms of action. So you can have potentially theft, money being diverted, tax to fund fighters, having a market effect. The price and the goods can have a price on local, an impact on local prices. So that creates additional tensions. You can have food items that are being distributed that are then resold in a little shop or market around the corner at different prices. You can have also this kind of substitution effect, that what we are doing by building a school is potentially, or building a road is substituting from the state, and it increases potential tension in terms of perception of the state is not present, and it's again the international community filling that void. The distribution effect, so also how whatever we are doing can reinforce existing inequalities between groups, and also, again, exacerbate social, political, or economic division. So I think that it's really understanding this two-way, what are we doing in the context and how the context shapes us as well. The third step is looking at adapt programming and managing the risk of feeding conflict. So here, what we are looking at is how to ensure that the activities continue to be relevant, appropriate, timely, and realistic. So it's on one hand, it's managing the conflict risk, and then at the same time, leveraging the opportunities to contribute to building and sustaining peace. So here we're really looking at, on one hand, we identify a risk. So for example, unequal distribution of service. So on one hand, we could look at putting and setting up a system to mitigate some of those risks. So making sure that the consultations are inclusive with the different communities, looking at a very clear and do no harm approach when it comes to beneficiary selection and criteria, putting in place grievance mechanism. But at the same time, you want to look at responding to that risk. So how do we engage with the group to understand their concerns? How do we communicate very clearly the selection criteria of the targeted beneficiaries? And these are all the questions that you need to ask yourself from a risk mitigation strategy at the design set of any intervention, but you also want to keep this as part of your risk log and monitor to look at this during the implementation. So really thinking about how these different potential risk factors are there. You knew them when you were thinking about your intervention, but as you go along with the implementation, new risks can emerge. So what are the risk mitigation strategies and how do you adapt your program? Maybe you're going to need to target a new geographical area because of access related questions. Maybe you're going to need to increase the number of young men from the host communities because there were tensions in how the host community was perceiving the activities for IDPs. So it's really thinking about how we want to look at risk and making sure that our intervention do not bring more violence and tensions. On this one, and of course, ideally, the more this is also done in consultation with inter-organization mechanism and coordination helps also the complementarity between projects, because your organization may be working with these set of IDPs, but then another organization is looking at the community next door, and then people are comparing, oh, but I can get a food item over there, I can get cash for work over there. So it's also thinking around the way our interventions are not operating in silo. You have different interventions and you also have different actors between your work, the development, and the peace building actors. Step 4 is looking then at how do we adapt programming from a let's not bring more risk and let's not bring more violence by do good and also do more. And this is really what we see in terms of what is the positive contribution to peace. So how with your intervention, you can actually integrate this peace building lens within the program, and looking a little bit at having peace building more as a secondary objective when your primary objective is to look at a humanitarian or a development goal, and thinking about what are the opportunities and those entry points that can come along in terms of thinking what kind of change are we trying to bring about, what kind of potential add-on your humanitarian intervention can do. And this looks at how do we address some of the peace and the conflict factors, how do we improve relationship among stakeholders. I think that a lot of the work that we see, particularly with the Peace Building Fund, it's a lot of the, and Emmanuel will touch about that in her presentation, it's how do we look at social cohesion adds on when we look at working with IDPs or with refugees, returnees, and host communities. So while at the same time working on mental health and SGBV, how can we also work on a peace field where women come from the host community and the IDPs and work together? So it also decreases tensions between the communities. I really like this map and this set of questions because I think it really shows the pathway and the key questions you want to ask yourself. So it's really looking at the 4 first steps that I talked about in terms of how do we understand the conflict? Second, how do we identify the risk, the opportunities, and the conflict dilemma? So is the activity still relevant, appropriate, and timely in the context? Yes. How is the activity perceived by the community? Is it possible to deliver the activity? Yes. Then really walking you through the different steps. And really, this is something that you want to ask yourself almost every day, because when we start with our intervention, it's also thinking about how we go along and keep on asking our questions. Is what we are doing today still relevant and appropriate for the context that we are operating in? And what has changed that I need to think of in terms of adapting my intervention? The step number 5 here is looking at monitoring and evaluation, and really thinking how when we work in understanding how the peace and the conflict dynamics affect the delivery of our activities, and thinking also how conflict risk are impacted by programming activities, and thinking also about identifying when new opportunities for peace emerge and how ongoing activities can be leveraged. I think that the one thing that I would really want you to keep in mind on the monitoring and evaluation part is that you need to think about funding this, because this is really, the different steps are really important, but without funding for the monitoring and evaluation bit, it's not going to happen. So you need to really think about how you're going to be measuring the progress, the outcome, and think also about how you want local stakeholders to be engaged. And I think that with the Peace Building Fund, and again, Emmanuel will provide concrete examples, thinking about what are the mechanisms. Is it going to be a perception survey? Is it going to be a community-based monitoring system? Is it going to be a dialogue mechanism? So I think that really thinking about how do we evaluate the conflict sensitivity, outcomes, and impact to really report on the result of the activities and identify the lesson that can then inform the OECD DAC criteria that we always look at in terms of the relevance, the effectiveness, the impact on the peace building outcomes. I think that with that, I kept to my 10 minutes, but I think really for me, the 2 things that I wanted you to keep in mind, it's a recognition that conflict sensitivity matters really for your work. And second, the 5 steps moving from understanding the peace and the conflict context, understanding how the program activities interact with peace and conflict, adapt activities and manage risk interactions, leverage opportunities for building and sustaining peace, and finally, monitoring and evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deanne, for setting the stage for this conversation so well. And I'm going to turn now to our four speakers who are going to share some very sort of succinct examples of what this looks like in practice from different perspectives. So my first panelist is Fabio Oliva. Fabio works at UNDP in the Crisis Bureau. Fabio, can you tell us how the existing conflict sensitivity guidance relates to practice, in particular in the fragile and complex settings that you have had the opportunity to work in? So Fabio, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Valerie. It's a pleasure to be here with this group. Look, just building on Diane's presentation on the principles, in practice, I think we have seen an evolution of the literacy on conflict sensitivity and do no harm across, humanitarian development and peace nexus actors. What probably remains a challenge is the implementation at the more strategic level. So, for example, I noticed that there's been, huge improvements of conflict sensitive programming when it comes to the project level. So, for example, past mistakes that we've seen, during the past crisis, like in Somalia, but also more recently, even Pakistan, building mobile courts that become themselves targets. So we try to do something good, but eventually we become also a target, militants in Balochistan, or examples about reconstruction of schools in Kyrgyzstan, where is the government suggesting where to build the schools when the government was also part to the conflict, interethnic violence in 2010. So those kind of probably mistakes and blunders are no longer so frequent. But where the challenge remains, I would say, is more at the institutional and strategic or systemic level of conflict sensitivity. And I'll be happy to provide a few examples from my experience. The last country I've been serving with the UN has been Tunisia. I was there as Peace and Development Advisor. And at one point, like in many other countries, I think the debt crisis, the food crisis, and also COVID hit all at once. And so at one point, the IMF was very interested to support the government with reforms. So those reforms were designed with the government, but eventually the UN did an analysis, was a conflict sensitivity analysis, looking at the impact of reforms. And there were, of course, very strong negative effects of those reforms on the most vulnerable, especially when it was about energy and food subsidy removal. And there was a strong correlation with potential risk of social unrest in the country. So we had data, we used what we call a UNDP crisis risk dashboard. That is a data platform. With a partnership with an NGO, we could actually look at concrete data around unrest, where were the sources, where were the locations, and also where were the main issues they were raising and were prompting unrest. So we did, a very discrete analysis. We provided this analysis to both IMF and the government. It was well received and led to tweaking also the program, and the support from the Peace Building Fund in this case was also very instrumental. Also, we should be asking questions about also how sometimes we do partner and we second some visions about, for example, migration or displacement that are counter to the principles of the UN. For example, we have espoused in some countries, again, Tunisia comes to my mind, a very securitized approach to managing migration that has led, for example, to unintended consequences in terms of social cohesion. So espousing a securitized approach in Tunisia meant that basically we were criminalizing migration, and eventually the host population, Tunisia, increased its sense of xenophobia and lack of social cohesion at community level. So we saw triggers of violence being prompted also by this kind of narrative around criminal activities surrounding migration. Cambodia also is another example, been working there. So this is maybe one of the examples more about fragility that comes to my mind, where because of the very strong shrinking space, human rights violations, at some point the European Union decided to activate some clauses around what is called everything but arms, which is a trade tariff agreement that provides preferential treatment to some least developed countries. And while the reasons for disconnecting the program were in terms, good because of human rights violations and non-performance, at the same time, the effect of that removal would have affected the garment sector, which was giving jobs to 1 million women. And if you put this together with that action in 2019, and then subsequently the advent of COVID, basically we had 1 million people that became, and if you multiply also because they were, single mothers, so households, that really led to a really huge impact economically on the most vulnerable. In that case, we did some modeling work with some economists, which I think is also very, very interesting, how we activated different parts of the international system to also serve for good analysis. And maybe the final examples I want to provide is from Guyana. Guyana has been at the forefront of work on social cohesion. I was working there around 2016 as a peace and development advisor. And the word social cohesion actually had become really a mantra for countries like Guyana, heavily divided across ethnic lines. And at one point, there was the new government that appointed a minister for social cohesion. So incidentally, that seemed to be a good idea. You have finally a partner you can promote social cohesion across society. But eventually, at the institutional level, there was an attempt to capture the narrative around social cohesion by the ministry. And that led, for example, for a lot of the UN programs to be captured and attempted to be used for campaigning. So in terms of looking at intended consequences, we should really use, and this is what I learned, a long-term view about how programs, how institutional agreements, how partnerships can eventually turn from a very initial good sense and an intent to do good into becoming do harm initiatives, because of the continuous evolution of the context in these countries we work on. As Diane said, conflict analysis should be really always continuously updated. The last point before I pass the floor to our panelists is about what kind of activities we look at in terms of conflict sensitivity. We have, I think, a bit of an obsession looking only the substantive part. So is this a peace initiative that is good? Are the beneficiaries being affected positively? But we tend to forget about, for example, procurement, the operational aspects of the programs. And that's where really the devil is in the detail, but that's where a lot of unintended consequences appear, where we have, some practices that are staff, thinking about the diversity of the country. We rely on partners for procurement that are the usual partners that speak English, are very good in terms of also knowing procurement procedures, but eventually that creates and reinforces, for example, some of the political economy issues and problems that eventually affect our work. Over to you, Valerie.
Thanks, Fabio. And I mean, I'm pleased to hear that we have made progress and there's less mistakes and blunders. But I think, as you highlight, there is still a ways to go, and these issues are really challenging. I'm very interested that you ended on the issue of procurement. At WFP, we recently had a review of an evaluation of our peace building policy, and one of the areas that was really highlighted, actually two of the areas that were really highlighted as needing additional work, were to really look at the need to mainstream conflict sensitivity on the procurement side, and the need to mainstream a conflict sensitivity approach on staffing and hiring of staffing, while an indication that on the programming side there had been much more progress. So I'm fascinated that you highlighted that more broadly, maybe reassured as well that it's not just us who have some problems there. Thank you for sharing those experiences. We are going to be moving next to Emmanuel Bernard, who is at the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. Emmanuel, what we really wanted to hear from you is how the Peacebuilding Fund has integrated conflict sensitivity in its portfolio in Darfur or elsewhere. So it would be good to hear from you on that. So over to you, please.
Thanks, Valerie. Thanks a lot. Let me just make sure that you see my my slides.
Yes, I see it.
Before I move forward. I wish you didn't see the, can't seem to go into presentation mode fully right now, but anyway, no, thanks a lot, Valerie. I mean, really interesting discussion today. I thought I would focus on Darfur, and knowing that perhaps many of the people in the room today may have worked on the program, but I thought it was an interesting one that reflected some of the key elements that Diane and Fabio just discussed. And really, maybe to frame this, I picked this example because it's one where we're able to conduct a bit of a evaluation in hindsight of the work that was done. And we're able to see, get a sense of measurement of the effectiveness of that sort of nexus approach that the program took. So just to maybe reiterate, I mean, from the Peace Building Fund side, obviously, I think the idea is really going beyond the do no harm principle and really contributing to peace. So we've been increasing our funding to humanitarian entities over time. WFP is one of them, where we've really raised the amounts in the past few years. UNHCR is another one where we've quadrupled funding over the past few years when we look at the numbers. And I think we're learning more and more as we move forward how we sort of adjust program design to make sure that we strengthen the P in the nexus and have humanitarian development and peace actors working together. So going to the Darfur program, a bit of context. So what I'm referring to right now, the example is in 2020, the PBF allocated about $20 million in funding to a series of projects, kind of a cohort of projects across the 5 states of Darfur. This was in the context of the withdrawal of UNAMID, the peacekeeping mission in Darfur. And so it was a little bit of a transition context, if you will. This set of interventions pulled together humanitarian and development agencies, one example on a variety of concomitant initiatives. One example is in East Darfur. That's just to give you a sense of the types of initiatives across the 5 programs. You know, you would jointly come into localities and work together on you know, community-based reconciliation mechanisms that were both dialogue settings and protection tools, natural resource management committees, conducting household surveys, planning and supporting plot demarcation, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll see it on the slides. The idea was to have together support to, so just backtracking a little bit, supporting in a humanitarian context a peace building endeavor. In terms of the process, maybe to reiterate what Diane was saying earlier, the design initiated, as it does in all of our PBF projects, on a joint conflict analysis. So that was mentioned several times. I think the key there, when you look in hindsight, is the extensive consultations that were done at community level during this initial conflict analysis process, really identifying root causes, key conflict dynamics, key stakeholders, relationships between them, and kind of not reinventing the wheel, but articulating clearly, jointly, what's the key areas of disputes and conflict risks were. A lot of this was around land disputes. So as part of the design, one of the outcomes, so there were 3 outcomes to the program. One of the outcomes sort of formulated as durable solutions for the return of IDPs and refugees are made possible by peaceful resolution of land disputes. And sustainable land and natural resource management facilitates enhanced agricultural productivity, processing, and value chains to create jobs and improve livelihoods. So the reason why I cite the outcome is to show the sort of merger or the nexus around the across the humanitarian and development and peace pillars. So from the design stage, it has to be conceived this way. Throughout implementation, additional participatory conflict analysis were worked into the project. So at locality level, in every locality, inception phase included additional consultations and local analysis, and worked into the work plans were biannual at a minimum, updates of the conflict analysis to really make sure that the project is still fit for purpose, to monitor the continuous do no harm. So let's say, so that's the sort of roving participatory analysis that enables us to see, well, if you've set an inclusive committee to jointly identify priorities at local level, is the composition effective? Has that created unintended negative consequences? And if so, you're able to adjust that thanks to the roving analysis. I want to mention another lesson learned was the institutional mechanisms that were put in place around the project. Beyond the project itself, the key agencies involved in the projects were all part of the Durable Solutions Working Group. So that enables another level of constant coordination and exchange on conflict sensitivity and do no harm. And I think that was also in Jan's presentation. Sometimes you just can't resolve it at project level. You have to coordinate with other actors beyond your own project. A quick point on the monitoring and evaluation. So I spelled out the way that the outcome was framed. This determined what indicators were picked to measure effective progress. I won't read out the 3 indicators, but that's key. You want from the start to formulate indicators that are measurable and that will enable you to continue the project implementation while monitoring that do no harm and social cohesion effects. The impact evaluation that was conducted last year on this project that ended on this series of programs that lasted 2 years and ended in 2022 was really interesting. So it was a bit of an innovative evaluation initiative that really looked at localities that had received that PBF funded support across the nexus versus localities that had not. And the evaluation was able through a various series of quantitative and qualitative sort of data collection and analysis to really conclude that where there was that holistic nexus support to returnees, IDPs, returnees, and host communities, it helped both address their needs and reduce the number of conflicts that had previously occurred over land. We talked about that sort of less tangible sense of social cohesion. One common way to measure that is through regular perception surveys and questionnaires to the communities. And in the communities that had received support, there was a clear increase in perception of peace committee effectiveness, increase in satisfaction with availability of services, and also incidentally, and I think we were a bit surprised by this outcome, but increase in school enrollment. So again, the evaluation found that, improvement in sanitation, administration of services, so that's the access to basic services that helped increase the satisfaction of local communities and indirectly reduce the level of conflict. So that's on the Darfur program, and please, I invite the attendants to come in with further comments that they have on this particular program. But maybe the last thing I'd mention is in Sudan, it's also one of the countries where the PBF, it conducted a pilot together with the UN Staff College and UNDP, taking into account the importance of more systematic and thorough conflict sensitivity in all of the UNCT's programming. So we developed this conflict sensitivity training tool, which is accessible online. I'm sharing the link, I'll share it in the chat as well, that really has a series of modules that takes step by step what Diane talked about, what Fabio talked about, and looks at the Sudan specific context, how this can be applied systematically. I think that's something that you can take a look at, that can be applied, be informative and help guide your planning and programming in other countries, but it's also something that could be developed in other humanitarian contexts, because it's helpful to come together with common tools and language around conflict sensitivity to enhance coherent approaches to programming. I don't know if I have more time, but if not, I'll end it here. I have another example in DRC that maybe we can talk about during the discussion phase.
Thanks so much, Emmanuel, and thank you for highlighting the situation in Darfur. I'm really left wondering how the population or the communities supported in this process have fared in recent months. But I'm also really struck by your emphasis on the importance of that analysis and monitoring throughout and in a kind of continuous way, really picking up on Diane's point about how it's really important to know whether what you're achieving, whether you're achieving what you set out to achieve, and how you might want to be adjusting that in the course of the project implementation. And I'm very impressed by the coalition of organizations that came together to make this process a success, and some of the intended and also unintended but super impressive positive results as well. Thanks for sharing that with us. Let's go now to Ron. Ron Clement is part of the Conflict Sensitivity Resource Facility in South Sudan. And Ron, we'd like to hear from you some examples of interventions in South Sudan that go beyond do no harm to positively contributing to peace. And in this context, where the humanitarian interventions themselves have the opportunity to reduce some of those conflict drivers that are present. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Ron, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I hope you're able to hear me. Thank you. And let me also take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the facility that I work for. We are the Conflict Sensitivity Resource Facility. We are based in South Sudan, and we provide conflict sensitivity advice to the donor community, as well as their implementing partners or the aid sector as a whole in the country. We do so by providing or generating knowledge through research and analysis. We also do tailored conflict sensitivity integration into the interventions of the various aid actors operating in this context. And lastly, we organize convening that is meant to share learning across the aid sector on matters conflict sensitivity, with the view of having aid delivered in a manner that does not contribute to conflict, but rather maximize the positive impact of aid that comes to the country. So that's it about the facility. And let me come back to the question that I'm requested to address here, which is examples of how people go beyond doing no harm, the do no harm principle, but rather try to contribute to peace. And I have laid in front of me 3 different examples. One that is more humanitarian, another example that is development oriented, and lastly, I also have an example that is peace building related intervention. And I have tried so much to use very practical examples at the field level, at the grassroots level, where we're actually implementing, conflict sensitivity. What does it look like practically? And conflict sensitivity differs from do no harm in the sense that it requires you to do more good, to take action when you see that you're likely, causing more harm or contributing to more harm with your intervention. It does not end at you mitigating, you contributing towards the harm, but rather, what steps do you take to actually help mitigate that tension? And that is the essence of conflict sensitivity. And one example that I can, for example, mention is, for example, you have an entity that goes into a community with the intention to construct a school. And in this context, where this school is to be constructed, you have 2 clans that live in the same context that are meant to share this facility for the learning of their children. But those 2 clans are in conflict, often fighting each other. So as a development actor, you go into this context to help provide a learning facility for the children, because you've done your assessments and you realize that that is quite a huge gap education, and that you now have a project that is meant to help those communities have a learning space for their kids. And while you go into this context, you've done your context analysis and realize that there is a conflict that exists in this community, And while you look at, mitigating the risks that may be associated to your assets, to your staff members, but there is also the risk that you could actually further, increase the tension and the conflict in this area through this particular intervention. For example, if you construct the school, who comes to that school? Is it going to be positioned in a place that is quite neutral, that can be accessible by the two communities? So, a conflict sensitivity blind intervention would not care about, first, where is the site that would be neutral, that would be considered neutral by the two conflicting communities, so that once the school is finally constructed, that all of them can have access to this facility. A conflict sensitive lens to this intervention would seek to understand the dynamics around this context, and and make sure that the school in itself does not end up favoring a particular section of the conflict actors, but rather use the school as an opportunity to bring them together. And they go beyond by ensuring that there are, other than the physical construction of the facility, there are avenues where the two communities can be brought together through dialogue initiatives. They may not necessarily be the agency responsible for conducting, dialogues between the two communities. But one thing they could do is, reaching out to peace-building actors in the same context that have that mandate to try to do some convening, to do some peace-building activities that bring the two communities together, and try to educate them on how they could, all of them, utilize this learning facility. So that is an example of, going beyond the do no harm principle, but rather, taking a step to ensure that you're contributing to peace in a particular context that is. And that is a development example that I had in mind. Another one that is more humanitarian oriented is where an agency, again, has conducted a piece of analysis in a certain context, and that you realize there are two neighboring communities that are food insecure, that is dire need for food aid to go into these communities. And you also know that in these two communities, they also have feuds against each other. They often fight amongst themselves. And while you go as a humanitarian actor to alleviate the suffering, to provide food aid, that you've done your analysis, and the analysis tells you that there is constant conflict in this area. And you know that if you do deliver the food aid to community A before you go to community B, the likelihood of community B attacking community A would be quite high. So what do you take? What steps do you take to ensure that you continue to help those that are in need of food aid, but in a manner that does not actually fuel existing tensions between the two neighboring communities? So prioritization becomes a big issue here. Which community do you start with? Because you've realized that the risk is that if you go to one of the two communities, the likelihood of the other community attacking with the intention, to actually have a share of the food is quite high. So a more conflict-sensitive approach would consider engaging both communities before actually starting your food distributions, because based on your assessment, you've seen that there is need for food aid in the two communities, but you can only deliver this food in one community at a go. You can only sequence the distribution of the food to the two communities. So perhaps one of the things that this actor would consider doing is having some discussions with the community leaders in community A and community B before actually starting food aid, and telling them that we've assessed and we've realized there is need for food assistance for both of you, but we can only start with one community. So as we continue to provide aid here, you should know that we're actually coming to community B. And these are quite, common examples, where, such incidents have affected communities in the context of South Sudan in which we operate. The mere, prioritization of service delivery has in itself been able to contribute to tensions and conflict in our context in South Sudan. And lastly, and I'm being cautious of time here, is it's a peace building example where an actor, and often this is quite common, an implementing partner has been instructed by the donor to have their peace building initiative in two, neighboring counties that are often in tensions, and that the peace building initiative is actually intended to help the two counties harmonize or address, the root causes of the tensions that are between them. So this particular donor advises their implementing actor to go to these two counties and provide peace building assistance, or convene peace dialogue activities, peace building activities in the two communities. And in the process of them implementing their project, they realized that apart from the two main communities that are seen by the donor to be in conflict, there's actually a neighboring county that is also contributing to this conflict between the two counties. So peace building, or actually rather, conflict knows no boundaries. While the donor only has funding for two counties, the implementing actor has realized that actually there's actually a third party into this conflict, which is a neighboring county. But they are constrained by the donor regulations to only have implementation in these two selected counties. They don't have the permission and the leverage, the mandate to be able to go beyond the boundaries of the two counties without the prior permission from their donor. So an actor, with less conflict sensitivity will continue to push on and only maintain programming in the two counties. But in actual sense, whatever gains they make in these two counties, peace building gains they make in these two counties, would often be washed away by the intervention of the third neighboring county that is not beneficial of this peace building initiative. So a peace building lens would ensure that there is some learning that is taken from how the intervention is interacting with actual context and having some adaptation in the process. And that is going back to the donor and telling them the reality that, oh, while we are making gains in the two counties, there's actually a problem because the third party is not part and parcel of the ongoing discussion that we're having. So how about we consider, including the third neighboring community into the discussion or into our peace building initiatives. I do not know if I have gone over time, but I would like to leave it here and hope that there will be more questions coming later on. Back to you, Valerie. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Ron, and super interesting examples as well. I mean, I'm really this whole issue of how we need to be understanding the nature of the tensions that may exist within a community or between different communities, and how when we enter that situation, that resource deficit situation with assistance, we have the risk of exacerbating those tensions, even based on sort of technical decisions that we're making, needs-based decisions that we're making on prioritization, and how through transparency and dialogue you can mitigate some of those risks. I mean, I think in the context that we're facing of growing needs and shrinking resources, that's just I think that's a very relevant example of some of the issues that we need to be giving sufficient attention to in our work. I have my last panelist now here. Last but not least, we have Vanessa Wyeth. Vanessa is the global lead for conflict prevention, fragility, and peace building at UNICEF. And Vanessa, it would be helpful to hear from you what you see as some of the key opportunities and obstacles to a broader application of conflict sensitivity in humanitarian interventions. Vanessa, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much. Let me just very quickly share my screen. Can you confirm that you see this presentation slide?
Got it.
Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to very quickly run through some of the fundamentals for us and just give you an overview of UNICEF's approach. But I wanted to, since it duplicates a lot of what's already been said, so I'll do this very quickly. I mean, we have a pretty straightforward framework for doing conflict analysis and conflict sensitive programming. It was developed actually in 2016. And we kind of, we think of it as the do no harm, do more good approach. And our goals here are really to reinforce the idea that analysis has to be linked to decision making, that it's an ongoing process, that there are different versions of what would constitute a conflict analysis or a scan, but that all of them are better than none, and that the more regularly and constantly you can do it, the better. And so I'm going to mainly focus on the conflict sensitive aspect of this, because I think this is something where we have a tendency as this community to say, well, of course we have to be conflict sensitive, but let's talk about how to be more peace positive. But, I think it's actually worth saying, and this is something I've been saying since I joined UNICEF over a year ago is like, are we really doing this well? To what extent are we doing this? And are we doing it systematically? Are we doing it intentionally? We have our analysis framework, which is very much like everyone else's. We want to get a sense of the state and map out the stakeholders. What have the dynamics of the conflict been? What are some of the root causes? What are the triggers? And importantly, what are the capacities for peace within these communities and within kind of local institutions? But the purpose of doing this is really to then think through how we as a peace building actor in this environment are impacting the environment and for better or for worse, and what we can do to do more, to do more good and less harm. And so I was very happy to hear, I think Fabio mentioned the issues of things like procurement, because we have essentially a conflict sensitivity, a set of checklists, right? One of which is supposed to be looking at what we think of as internal conflict sensitivity that really looks at, our personnel, our human resources, our operations, our procurement, our financing, our office culture and the way we communicate internally as an office, and really reinforcing the importance of that and the way that we operate, the way that we deploy resources in this space, and the way that we, the people that we hire, the people that we work with. And so, I've got some examples here of some of the questions that we encourage offices to ask that have to do with just, from basic capacity of staff to taking a look at who we have on staff in both country offices and field offices. Are they representative of the populations they're working with? Are they coming from these communities? Are we being inclusive and conflict sensitive in our hiring practices? Procurement obviously is a very, very big issue. Obviously, UNICEF has massive supply division and a lot of supply work, but encouraging that lens to be applied down to the field office when they're making decisions about, how to pre-position supplies, where to pre-position supplies, who we work with locally, especially as we try to, lean forward on things like the localization agenda, who we are partnering with locally, and then the ways in which we communicate internally as an organization, and the ways that we set in place mechanisms to ensure kind of ongoing conflict sensitivity and crisis response. And then we have, the more traditional way of, what we call external conflict sensitivity, which is how we do our programming, who we partner with, how we choose beneficiaries, what messages we send, what are the perceptions of the way we engage, and how do we remain impartial while delivering programming in conflict. And this is kind of like the way we work in conflict settings or places where there is a risk of conflict. And I think this has been well covered by some of the presentations that went before me, so I'll very quickly move on. We encourage colleagues to think of this as a constant cycle, right? That you do your analysis or a light scan, you think about the impacts of your interventions, you design for do no harm, you reflect on how that's going, and you adapt. And this is not a one-off. This is not something you do once and then you go on do your programming. This is not something that you tick a box, but it really has to be embedded in the mindset of how you approach programming in a conflict setting. And this is challenging. I have on the right side, I have a box here that is really a little bit more about kind of the development side of our country planning and programming in terms of the various places where a conflict analysis could happen, and for what purpose. But when it comes to the humanitarian side, I think there's a little bit, there's some different entry points, and I'll cover them in the last slide. The other thing that we've done, in the current strategic plan, which is 2022 to 2025. Peace building was elevated as a cross-cutting priority for UNICEF. And we also, at the same time, updated our core commitments for children and humanitarian action, which is kind of our guiding framework for child rights and humanitarian settings, to include the requirement that all programming be conflict sensitive. And so in doing that, we've introduced now in our results framework for the strategic plan indicators that are meant to track the performance of country offices in actually doing this. And so, you know, we have indicators in our annual results reporting that really is looking at to what extent country offices have done a conflict analysis, and having done a conflict analysis, are they implementing at least 2 conflict sensitivity practices during the reporting period? And this could be, there's a whole range of options here, you know, that we've already discussed, but trying to just get a sense for ourselves of how we are doing in this, whether we're doing it systematically and intentionally, and then trying to see those numbers go up, particularly given how many contexts in which we work have a risk of conflict relapsing, a risk of conflict getting worse. I just find, you know, just to keep this as short as possible, just some reflections on kind of what we've learned, what we've observed, and really the kind of entry points for humanitarian. One thing that we're trying to reinforce is, you know, a good enough analysis, that there is no one right way to do a conflict analysis, that you don't have to, you know, have a massive budget to hire either a team or a, you know, a PhD to come and do, you know, 3 weeks of focus groups and everything else, and write a 50-page report that looks at the entire country, that then sometimes sits on a shelf or doesn't necessarily get integrated into programming, but that you need to think about how to build this way of thinking and this kind of political economy mindset into every aspect of your decision making. That when you do an analysis or commission an analysis, that there's a clear link to the decisions that it will inform, right? And there are multiple decisions that they could inform. I think one very, very important lesson, this has come through in everyone else's presentations as well, is that, you know, you're really, the analysis that you do and the lens of conflict sensitivity needs to inform your program design really down to the project level, down to the level of project documents, you know, like local partners. One example, for example, I was in South Sudan in October with the country offices doing their big field operations retreat, and the education sector raised the example of a school building program in Wow State, Wow County, that had great success, had built a number of schools, but there was one community or 2 communities where they thought they had identified where the school would go. It was meant to serve different communities, but what they hadn't realized is that there were different maps going back to the 1950s as to what the name of this town was, and the name was claimed by different communities. And so they had not consulted with like the land management office in that region when they made the selection. They tried to get around it. They tried to call the schools like Harmony and Peace, you know, but ultimately they were told by the communities that building the schools would create conflict, would introduce conflict, and they had to ultimately say the best course of action was not to build the schools. So that's one example. It was a relatively small example in a much bigger program that had been very successful, but it's an example of the type of waste that happens, the type of wasted effort, wasted money, and frankly, failure to meet your beneficiaries if you don't build this type of analysis into every aspect of your projects. Another lesson we've learned is really, and this I think is particularly challenging for humanitarian actors, is that kind of culture of an organization of really recognizing that by the very virtue of the fact that we are deploying resources and working with partners in these communities and working with beneficiaries, we are already a peace building actor. Whether we think of ourselves as obviously impartial and neutral, we are impacting the environment, and we need to be very sensitive and intentional about the way we do that. Capacity of country staff is an ongoing process. This is not like a one-off training, but it's really this constant reinforcing these skills, accountability for doing this, trying to ensure that our frameworks and our guidance are as light as possible, that they're as usable as possible, and really focusing on things like minimum standards and checklists to make sure that everyone is at least working at some baseline level. And then specifically when it comes to humanitarian entry points, we have a lot of options here. I've already said conflict sensitivity has been integrated into the CCC, the core commitments for children. We are updating, for example, the emergency procedures, which look at kind of literally the preparedness planning and also, the procedures that kick in emergency settings, whether it's L1, L2, L3, and where would conflict analysis fit there? Where would you require it? Where's accountability for doing that? We've made other commitments under, other like the humanitarian bargain, things like accountability to affected populations, the localization agenda. We take these very seriously, and we're really moving forward on them, but recognizing the need that you also have to do this in a conflict sensitive way, and this applies across the board. And then the other thing that we can do, obviously, is in all of the other humanitarian, coordination mechanisms that we sit in, all of the kind of assessments and planning and monitoring frameworks that we're in, that we can do more to advocate for inclusion of conflict analysis in that. And then in the ones where there is a conflict analysis happening, and that we advocate for the inclusion of a child rights lens, because obviously for us, that's our mandate, and that's where we add value into ongoing other kind of conflict and peace building processes. I'll stop here, but very much welcome any questions, and really enjoyed the other presentations as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Vanessa, and it was really great to see how systematic of an approach that UNICEF has taken. I think that really gives you the opportunity in a situation where you're trying to drive change across and drive an approach across an organization. You have to really look and address this in a systematic and continuous way. So we're going to move to the Q&A. I have to say, this was a brilliant set of presentations. Everybody went long. I'm just going to tell you all that, but I was riveted, so I didn't cut you off. But we have eaten into our Q&A time, which basically means we've got 15 minutes for questions. So I will go to any questions posed in the chat, but also questions if you raise your hand. I think what I'll do is I'll take a round of questions, chat and otherwise, and then we'll come back to the respective panelists to answer them so that we can let you go in 15 minutes. So I see that we have I'm only getting part of the name here. Jumana is the last name who has asked for the floor. Yes. I will give you the floor, Jumana.
Hi, quickly, I'm from Lebanon, Women, Peace and Security portfolio with UN Women. I find it difficult to differentiate between do no harm and conflict analysis. Sometimes they overlap quite a lot. In Lebanon, due to the situation in Gaza, for example, we've reduced our visibility and use our logo in the activities we do in the affected area because it can backlash on our women and it could create more conflicts in the south. So in addition to programmatic issues and the procurements we do, we should also look at how our visibility and communications work can affect conflict positively or negatively, and usually negatively in many instances where people don't want to be associated with certain government funding or the UN or other actors. It's better to be in the backstage doing work than to contribute to more conflict at community level, especially for us. We have women in the leadership position, which put them at higher risk of being, in the middle of a community conflict that we really want to avoid. Thank you.
Thank you, Jumana. So is there a distinction between do no harm and conflict analysis, and does it matter? I'll come to the panel in a moment. Let's go to Lisa Muller. Over to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for the interesting panel. I'm Lisa Müller-Dommel. I'm with the Danish Refugee Council here in Geneva. Yeah, I really appreciate your analysis and your explanations. I coordinate the Global Mine Action area of responsibility here in Geneva, but I also manage the advocacy and peace building for DRC at Geneva level. I was just curious, there is and this relates back to the question that we had before, and the colleague from South Sudan has said it very well. To my understanding, conflict sensitivity goes beyond the do no harm approach, the distinct, it's an ongoing process, and it's also one that oftentimes requires additional resources and resources that are sort of put in place in the long term, which is something that in the humanitarian space we don't get the funding for. In many ways, it's project based. So I think I think it's sometimes very dangerous if we keep on equating or conflating do no harm and conflict sensitivity analysis, because it doesn't give us the space of regularly doing that, and we also have to hold our donors accountable to fund this properly. So I'm just curious on people's thoughts about what has worked with the various donor communities to specifically fund this effectively on a more long term, beyond the sort of project-based level. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Lisa, also for highlighting where does the money come from, and are there any good practices to share in that regard? Morgan, over to you next.
Thanks, Valerie. I think that, yeah, that's the question. We all want to know, where is the money? Where is the money coming from? So I support Lisa. Hi, everybody. My name is AJ Morgan. I am the advisor on peace and security for IOM. I am our global focal point on conflict sensitivity. My question, and thanks to all of the panelists for your really interesting presentations. My question relates to how you are framing conflict sensitivity in terms of contributions to peace versus the word peace building. And I know that was something that we used a lot throughout this presentation, but it's something that I've had to really try to put a lot of thought into organizationally. Are we framing peace building in terms of specific types of activities and programs that, for example, have peace outcome indicators that are maybe, specifically trying to address root causes of conflict? And then how do we navigate that conversation if we're also trying to make the case, for example, that conflict sensitivity is something that should be integrated throughout all programming across the humanitarian development peace nexus? How are we then, kind of making that distinction between conflict sensitivity and peace building, or conflict sensitivity as a way to contribute towards a peaceful foundation? So any thoughts on that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Morgan. And I think that is also a really important question about the need to look at where conflict sensitivity mainstreaming stops and peace building explicitly begins. And this issue of the outcomes is a good way to track that. Okay, I don't see any comments, questions now, so let's go back to the panel and we see if you have answers to these questions, and if we have time for a second round, then we do that. So I will ask you all to be short, and Diane, I'll start with you.
Sure, maybe a couple of points. I think on the funding question, it's a very good point. And I think that it's really looking and thinking how we go beyond a project-based approach and put in place systems. So I think that within the UN, within the different partners, it's how you have a common advocacy that sometimes we need resources to be pooled and put together to allow this. I love the way, for example, in the Central African Republic, there was a joint effort for the different partners and the UN under UNDP's leadership worked at putting together perception surveys all around the country with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative to really document and assess on a regular basis what were the perception of the population on key peace and security issues. And I think that it's this kind of model and advocacy that I think we all need to have at the different levels where we work, that we need to have the resources and we need to share those resources, because I think that beyond the funding point, it's how we also share the different type of analysis. You're going to have a risk dashboard that is being used by one partner. How is the set of information shared, and how do we put put together the different tools that UN agencies have together, NGOs, because it's also how do we reconcile and connect the local to the regional and the national levels of analysis and updates in a country. So that's on the funding and the tools. Quickly on the conflict sensitivity and the peace building differences, AJ. For me, I think that conflict sensitivity is a way of working. It's the way, it's a methodology, and peace building, it's really then setting up a vision and the kind of changes you want to have and the kind of institutional group behavior you want to go about with a peace building vision. Where do you want the communities to be in 2 years, 3 years? While conflict sensitivity is the way all of us need to have this as a methodology in the humanitarian, in the development, and in the peace building angle. The last point, to go back to the colleague from Lebanon, I totally agree with you. You really touch upon this issue of communication, which we hinted to between Vanessa and my presentation about how do we communicate. Particularly, I'm thinking today in the Sahel, you look at shrinking civic space, so who and perceptions of different partners and relationships. So I think that the way we communicate is definitely part of conflict sensitivity. Looking at the differences between do no harm, and you were asking conflict analysis. So conflict analysis is understanding your context, and then do no harm is looking at really then not impacting. And I think one of our human rights colleague, I think it's interesting, she was telling us, how can we do better in terms of do no harm our project? And the key question she was asking us to reflect on it, does the project include a clear identification of potential harms that the UN and partners could do potentially, inadvertently, and cause to individual? And then what is the plan with specific measures that you want to mitigate the risk? And I think that it's this kind of questions you want to have when you think about the do no harm approach. Maybe I'll let others to complement Valerie.
Thanks, thanks, Diane. So I'll go to the panelists now, and here, if you want to challenge something Diane said, please do. We encourage it. If you don't repeat it, we don't need to hear anything again. So if you agree with what she said, let's just take it there. But we do have some additional questions, so you can also choose to answer one of these questions. We have a question on social cohesion and whether there is any examples of handing off established peace committees from humanitarians to development professionals. I think an important question there. We have a question around localization and the important role of local actors as part of Nexus programming, and particularly around these issues of conflict sensitivity and peace building, if anybody wants to take that on. And we have the issue of joint analysis and the importance of joint analysis across the nexus, as opposed to analysis that happens by humanitarians, by development professionals, or by peace building actors. So why don't we try for each of you to take on the one question, either previous or existing, that you feel you're best placed to contribute to, and hopefully we'll get them all answered in that way. So Fabio, over to you to pick the one that you want to respond to.
Thank you for the one question challenge. And so I'll pick up the one that I think resonates with the second and third intervention about connecting conflict sensitivity to the longer term, right? And also feeding into the peace building outcomes. I think that's a really great question. So I think we should all think in longer terms, right? And it's not just humanitarians, it's also development and peace building actors. And so, for example, sometimes, building and designing prevention strategies can be a way where you anchor development in the longer term, but then you also have what I call hooks here and there that can be planted in your programs, your strategies, that can become multipliers of activities, or can be resuscitated later on if the political and context and the conflict changes over time. And the example, and I'm glad to see ILO colleagues in Tunisia, we developed as part of a prevention action plan, a social dialogue program that has been now funded by the Peacebuilding Fund. And the way we've been designing is it's creating an anticipatory platform for should social dialogue become something bigger and more important, and should also social issues become more prevalent in conflict in Tunisia, that platform will become also a peace-building platform for political and peace-building dialogue. So you actually make sure that, first of all, labor issues don't exacerbate the social unrest. So that's the do no harm angle that we started with. But then over time, it feeds into the political and peace-building work that we like to pursue in a country where we know there's systemic fragilities. So that's one way to do it. Just cheating on the two things, Marcus, look at LEDERAC work on Somalia, how humanitarian actors and their own community dialogues were handed over to the peacebuilding and the development actors. Over.
Sorry, Valerie, you're on mute.
Okay, over to you, Emmanuel, for your one question challenge. And I hope you take the money question, but you can take a different one if you want to.
No, thanks, Valerie. Look, I only have 2 quick points to complement what others have said. I mean, just on that issue of peace building, just to hone in on the point that really, I think a lot of the times it's about the transformational change. And so going back to the Darfur program example, one thing about the way that the outcomes were formulated is that that's what they were measuring. And one of the indicators was kind of revealed that the program had helped with greater inclusivity of women in decision making. There were perception surveys that showed that women felt more comfortable in the target villages in participating in community life. So these types of cumulative transformational changes are really, I think, what it comes down to when we talk about peace building programming. And I think going back to what you said, Valerie, as well, is that it's not a magic wand. So even, no matter how much we get to do, not everything is within our control. And I think the Sudan situation right now, in spite of all of the investments and support that were provided at local level, you can't control various, complex national level dynamics that might undermine genuine progress at local level sometimes. So I think that we just have to live with and continue to grapple with. Maybe a quick point on localization, absolutely crucial. I think that's something that we think about a lot at the PBF. How do we make sure that all of the projects have a significant injection of strengthening localization, working with local actors as much as possible at the grassroots level, passing on capacities, empowering local actors to really lead in the development and implementation of projects. And I think that's where, again, the nexus comes together quite well. You want to go from, you want to go towards reducing need. And so really working closely with empowering local actors to make decisions and design projects themselves. So I think that's what I'd say. And on the funding, coordinating across the increasingly small funding resources is crucial, but that does take a lot of work, planning, coordination, exchanges together, and kind of common view on common priorities. Over.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So Ron, over to you for your one question challenge.
Thank you so much. I think a lot has been said, and I really wanted to have a comment on the difference between conflict sensitivity and peace building, but I've chosen to actually post something that may be useful in the chat, so that you can also use that to reflect on in terms of what we see as a difference between conflict sensitivity and peace building. And I'll leave it there. That is not to say that it is perfect. We continue to learn as the context evolves. So, but I think the main thing is that peace building tends to look at root causes, while conflict sensitivity seeks to understand the interaction between your intervention and the context, and using that understanding to shape your interventions or learn from it. I would like to comment particularly on the idea of funding. Where is the funding? As a facility, we are currently funded by the donors to provide, conflict sensitivity advice to the aid actors in the country. That is not quite a common thing in many countries. I think it is unique to a few number of countries where you have actually a facility that provides free service on conflict sensitivity to the aid actors. I think even within us, we know that the idea of having conflict sensitivity facilities may not be very, very sustainable because we rely on donor funding, which is not often available. So the most important thing when we look at the funding question is integrating conflict sensitivity into our own programs, in our internal systems. And since conflict sensitivity, as we all agree, is a cross-cutting theme across all our operations, logistics, HR, program. There's no section that does not need conflict sensitivity. So it is best integrated instead of having it funded separately. And if I can, quickly dive into the localization discussion, it is very crucial to have, locals involved in conflict analysis or contextual analysis, because conflict sensitivity relies so much on the understanding of the context. So when you do your context analysis, in absence of local, people, the chance for you to lose out a lot in terms of you understanding the real issues is quite high. So it is very, very crucial that we bring on board local knowledge when we are doing that conflict or context analysis to inform our interventions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ron, and also for highlighting what is a very active exchange in the chat, which I encourage you all to have a look at and peruse also after the meeting, with some great resources being posted as well. Vanessa, over to you. If you can respond to one of the questions that haven't been answered yet, or if you have something to add to one of the ones that have been, please go ahead.
Sorry, I agree very much with a lot of what has been said. I did want to kind of speak to the how do you frame your actions? Do you frame them as contributions to peace? Do you frame them as peace building? Do you frame them as social cohesion? We have a new, like a peace building programming framework that we have updated and are rolling out. And the thing that I most want to reinforce with country offices is that, peace building is not a distinct line of programming for UNICEF. We don't have a peace building program. It's not one of our goal areas, but it's a lens and it's an approach that we can lay over any of our existing sectoral work. And so, as Dan said, it's really kind of what are the objectives and what is the goal, the vision you have of how an education program can contribute to peace, of how a WASH program can contribute to peace, and just, I think obviously the language that we use in these settings can be very fraught. And certainly there's country offices where the government and other partners are much more comfortable talking about social cohesion than about peace building. There's a lot of settings where other partners are talking about, PVE and stabilization, which we are not comfortable talking about as objectives for the work that we're doing. And so I think really looking beyond just the labels that we use and the content of the approaches that we're trying is super important. I'm going to take 1 second to say on the localization, I think that is an incredibly important area, and one where I do see some progress. So for example, in our emergency planning procedures, we now require, in the mapping that country offices have to do about potential civil society partners, we require that they also map the number of women-led organizations, for example, that of local organizations to partner with. And so they're very, you really have to look at the frameworks and the procedures and all of the kind of bureaucratic processes that you have as an organization, and then figure out how to embed this into each of them, rather than create a whole new framework that needs its own structure to implement. I think that's it's harder, but it's the only way you have actual durable change in behavior as an organization.
Thanks so much, Vanessa, and really thank you to all of you for an excellent set of speakers and panelists, a great set of questions and real engagement from the group. I think it's I think there's maybe I'm getting a feeling that localization and peace could perhaps be the topic for one of the future dialogues. I think this is something that would be really fascinating and would bring together several streams of the work that we are doing in the operational policy and advocacy group. But just to say that I am sure we're all looking forward to the future peace dialogues, and if this participation is what we have to look forward to, and this quality of conversation, then it should be a very interesting series indeed. So a big thanks to the Task Force 4 group that have pulled this together, to Yus, to Barbara, to Marcia, to all of you, and really a big thanks to all of you for your engagement today. Sorry we kept you just a few minutes long, but I hope it was well worth the additional time. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day wherever you are. Go in peace. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.